Hello Internet, welcome back to Tromsø Twilight, the channel where I, Vincent, talk to you, the Abyss, about books, movies, music I enjoy, find interesting, or a combination of the two. Now recently on YouTube there have been a series of videos about difficult books. What makes a book difficult? Should we read difficult books? What are the advantages or the rewards of difficult books? And I've seen a few of these and found them pretty interesting. Now I think it's a tag that somebody started, and tags on YouTube are this kind of like social networking thing that I don't understand. So respect to anybody who started the tag or is involved. I'm just going to put the video that inspired me to make this one in the description. And if you're interested in that social side of it, you can follow that and orient yourself in that. Regardless, I found it an interesting topic, and I wanted to talk about some books that I personally have found challenging or difficult in various ways. I think it's an interesting conversation about what makes a book difficult. You know, like a book like House of Leaves, for example, that people often mention. It's very kind of formally inventive and it wrong foots the reader a lot, but I don't actually think it's a particularly difficult reading experience. At least it wasn't for me. Other books that are linguistically difficult, like Sound and the Fury, I didn't find particularly challenging because they have a certain rhythm and a certain vitality that kind of drew me through the text. And I think it's a case of like, if you surrender to the form, then it's not difficult as such, even though it might be disorienting. The same might be said of William Burroughs' cut-up experiment books like The Soft Machine. They're very difficult if you approach them in the way you would a conventional novel, looking for meaning in that way. But if you approach them as experiments, works of art, I don't necessarily find them difficult. Actually, I find his attempts at more conventional fiction later more difficult because I find that stuff more boring. So what I've done is I've gone through my collection and picked out 8 books that I remember as being both challenging and interesting, and that I still remember in various ways, to illustrate different ways that books can be difficult. But I want to say before I go through them that I didn't choose psychoanalytical books or philosophy books. I might at some point do a video about books that have been formative for my particular personal view of the world, and if I do so, then I will include some of these books then. The first book I'm going to talk about is A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing by Eimear McBride. This book came out in 2013. It's a debut novel from an Irish writer. Somebody that people often talk about as difficult is James Joyce. Ulysses is a book that people often talk about. Finnegan's Wake is, for many people, almost an unreadable book. This book is arguably influenced by Joyce and by that style of kind of musical stream of consciousness writing. There might also be some influence from Samuel Beckett on this book. I'll give you an example of, I'll just read you the beginning of the book. For you, you'll soon give her name. In the stitches of her skin, she'll wear your say. Mommy, me, yes you. Bounce the bed, I'd say. I'd say that's what you did, then lay you down. They cut you round. Wait and hour and day. Walking up corridors, up the stairs. Are you all right? Will you sit, he says. No, I want, she says. I want to see my son. Smell from the Dettol through her skin. Mops diamond floors, tiles, all as strong. So Eimear McBride, I think, is a really interesting example because it has this immediate challenge of the linguistic style, which you'll find in Joyce or you'll find in Faulkner that I mentioned earlier. And there's something about allowing the rhythm and the sound and the images to carry you. And after a while, it's like you learn the language of the book in the same way that you do in A Clockwork Orange, for example. But what also makes this book difficult is, like in A Clockwork Orange, learning the language of the book connects you more to the character. You identify very closely with the protagonist of the book. And her life is so extremely brutal and traumatic that it makes the book difficult in kind of multiple ways. The poetry and the inner workings of the mind of the character creates a kind of connection that makes the traumatic nature of the content more visceral, more shocking. So I think that's kind of one way in which a book can be difficult, challenging. This is the kind of book that I loved it, but it's difficult to think of a person you would recommend it to. And I actually bought it for my friend, and I think he didn't finish it. The second book on the list is another novel. It's by the Mexican author Cristina Rivera-Garza, and it's called No One Will See Me Cry. I've read a couple of other books by her. The Iliac Crest was the first one that I read. They have been shorter and very, very elusive, kind of strange. They're difficult to get a grasp on the actual narrative often. And this one is an earlier book by her. I think it's written in the 90s, and it's a historical fiction text which is set in a psychiatric hospital. Now, the thing about this one is that it has more of an evident narrative. It has flashbacks within the novel. It has more clearly defined characters and events. It's got a political backdrop. It has a social critique around the treatment of women, around psychiatry. But it has the same weird, elusive nature, so that it's like reading a historical fiction novel that you can never quite get a grasp on. And that's something unusual, I think, in that genre. I found it really kind of fascinating and unsettling, but ultimately difficult to describe. And in that way, it was quite a challenging, difficult book. It's like it's constantly slipping away from you. The next one is difficult in a different way. This is Unruly Times by A.S. Byatt. Byatt is known as a novelist, but she's also an academic, and this is her book about Wordsworth and Coleridge and the time that they lived in the Romantic era. I found this book difficult because of its project. It's like a biography of their inner lives, Coleridge and Wordsworth, and their development as poets, at the same time as it's a kind of exploration of the cultural and political climate of the time. And then it's also about the development of their attitude towards poetry. And particularly Coleridge was very interested in philosophy. It's weird to describe why this is difficult, but what I can say about it is that it kind of creates a story about two men out of minutely researched details. And despite the fact that they are very vital in their writing, it has a certain academic dryness to it. But it's also shot through with a weird kind of melancholy. It's a real strange reading experience, I think, personally, and it took me quite a long time to get through it, but I felt very grateful for it at the end because I really felt like I understood more about the time and these two literary figures. Next up on the list, Cain by Jean Toomer. Now, this book I've read twice, and I have to say I think it's one of my favourite books because it's extremely formally inventive, and that's why I chose to talk about it. Now, it has a play in it, it's got poetry in it, it has what seem to be short stories in it, but it's considered a novel. And this is why I kind of think it's challenging, because it's a novel thematically. It's a novel about race in America, but it's a novel created of parts that are only connected in terms of their theme and the atmosphere and emotion that he is creating of kind of horror, terror, paranoia. It's, in my opinion, far more experimental and brave than a lot of the other modernist works from the same period who were written by white authors and Europeans. I think Toomer really pushed the boundaries of what can be considered a novel. It has some sections that are quite difficult to understand, like they are written in more of a stream of consciousness or a poetic mode. It has others that are more direct, and you're left with the job of kind of creating a whole out of these jigsaw pieces. I think it's really brilliant, but it's definitely not an easy book in terms of theme, in terms of how it makes you feel, or in terms of the challenge it sets you to create your own understanding of it. Now, I was uncertain whether I was going to include this next book because even though it's short and even though I've returned to it many times, I'm not sure if I've ever read it in its entirety. But this is a book from the 90s, The Age of Wire and String by Ben Marcus. Ben Marcus is an experimental writer. I also read his book, The Flame Alphabet. I didn't like it very much. But this book I return to often because it's so strange. It is such a weird text. It has these short microfictions that are almost incomprehensible. Like, he uses language that you recognize, but the words don't mean what they normally mean, and he also coins a lot of other words. At the front of the book, he has a quote from Emerson: "Every word was once an animal." The book starts with a section called Argument, where he kind of explains what it is, at least nominally. This book is a catalogue of the life project as prosecuted in the age of wire and string and beyond, into the arrangements of states, sites and cities, and further within the small houses that have been granted erection or temporary placement on the perimeters of districts and river colonies. The settlement, in clusters and dispersed, has long required a document of secret motion and instruction, a collection of studies that might serve to clarify the terms obscured within every facet of the living program. Almost like science fiction, it might remind you of Borges in a way. He has lots of glossaries in the text, terms, where he just kind of gives words and then gives their explanations. Landscarf, a garment that functions also as a landmark, shelter or vehicle. To qualify, the item must recede beyond sight, be soft always, and not bind or tear the skin down. Air hostels, elevated, buoyed, or lifted locations of safe harbour. They are forbidden particularly to dogs, whose hair cell fabric is known to effect a breach of anchors, casting the hostel loose towards a destiny that is consummated with a crash, collapse, or burst. Another book this kind of reminds me of is The Atrocity Exhibition by J.G. Ballard, if you've read that. It's like the whole thing is kind of describing something that's beyond your grasp. Each small section is so packed with references that you probably can't understand. I think an admirable book for going as far as it does in its project and for being so unique. So we're getting to the last 3 books on my list, and these 3 are all important to me for different reasons, but also challenging for different reasons. The first one is The Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot. Now, I think this is in the running for my favourite book. It's one of my favourite books. I read it first when I was in my early 20s, or perhaps I was 19. At the time, I was very struck by the imagery in it and by the opening of the first poem, Burnt Norton. And I returned to these opening lines many times, but I don't know, I think I only read the whole thing once. And then last year, when I was sort of trying to process the death of somebody that I cared about, I went back to this book and I read it again, and I read it several times and again and again. And this book is, I think, difficult because Eliot is trying to describe and refer to things that are beyond our grasp. Like, he's trying to talk about what is a moment, what is now, and he's trying to talk about what is time, and he's trying to describe the experience of a human in history and this feeling of being connected to ancestral evolutionary lines. He's also talking about God, about his relationship to the church. He's talking a lot about death, his own death, the death of others. He's talking about poetry. It must be, I think, one of the most ambitious books I've ever read, and every time I read it, I think it's more beautiful. It's the kind of book I think I can probably read for the rest of my life, and every time I read it, gain something more out of it. It becomes a little more familiar, and its familiarity opens up new doors. The next book on my list is Pan by Knut Hamsun. Now, this was difficult for me for a particular reason. It's one of the first proper literary novels I ever read in Norwegian, and it's already, I think, quite a difficult book. It's a strange novel about a guy in a forest in Nordland, in North Norway, kind of living as a poacher, and then his relationship to a local family. And it's a book that's a lot about irrationality. So one of the reasons it's difficult or challenging is that it's very hard to understand the motivations of the characters, and especially the central protagonist. Some of the challenge in this book, stylistically, also lies in the fact that Hamsun was one of the first modernist writers. He wrote and published his first novel, Sult, Hunger in English, late in the 19th century. And this book is one of his, I think it's his third novel, one of his first novels. He's trying to create a sort of modernist or experimental way of writing about nature, which is kind of unusual. A lot of the modernist books that we read are quite urban. But for me also, it was a book that when I read it, my Norwegian reading skills were only just good enough to manage to read this book. I mean, it's written in a quite old-fashioned Norwegian, and so I really had to strive to read. And that's another thing I think is interesting about like difficult books, challenging books. When you're reading like just outside your comprehension level, it can be so extremely rewarding. So this book is very close to my heart. The last one on the list is The Complete Poems of Walt Whitman. This is essentially the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass, plus all of his earlier poems, plus some earlier versions of his most well-known poems. Walt Whitman essentially wrote the same book, Leaves of Grass, his entire life. It has all of his most famous poems in it, but it's just quite an enormous collection of poetry. I challenged myself to read this whole thing about 10 years ago, and I didn't know Walt Whitman before I started reading it. Now, one of the things that makes this book difficult or challenging, unlike the others, is just sheer volume. It's one person's view of the world throughout their whole life in their poetry, all collected together in one place. And it's both a challenge and an enormous reward to get to know a poet in that way. I'm actually reading the Dylan Thomas omnibus now, which is most of his published work, and it's a similar experience. But the other thing about Walt Whitman is that there's this sort of like wild vitality to a lot of his work that is sort of challenging. It's like it requires a lot of energy of you as a reader to kind of get into these long lines, this kind of ecstatic writing that he has a lot of the time. A lot of his poems, especially some of the earlier ones in Leaves of Grass, they're kind of like long lists. There's one poem that I really loved in here. I don't remember what it's called or whether it has a name, but Whitman is standing by the shore of the ocean and he's looking into the water and he's seeing sea life. And from there he's thinking up to above the heavens what must exist out in space. I think it's like the only time I've ever read somebody from his era writing about aliens. Like he's just confronted with the complexity of life and he's there thinking, imagine what lies beyond our Earth. But yeah, it was hard work. It took me a while, but it was very rewarding, and I'm kind of both proud of myself and glad to have that relationship with Whitman. So those are the books that I thought about immediately. Even as I was doing it, I thought of several others that I could have listed. For example, I just finished reading Paradise Lost. Maybe I'll do a video about that on its own. Please do jump in the comments, have a conversation with me about challenging books that you've read. Ideally ones that you've enjoyed or that you found rewarding. What is it that makes them challenging? What is it that is the reward? I hope you've had a good time listening to my examples, and maybe I'll see you again.